The North Vietnamese Army regular crouched behind the reinforced earth and timber of his bunker firing port, watching the narrow trail that wound through the jungle below. He had been here for 3 months, dug into the mountainside like a tick, and not one American patrol had detected the position. The bunker was a masterpiece of concealment, its entrance camouflaged beneath fallen logs and creeping vines. The firing port itself no more than a dark slash in the hillside that blended perfectly with the shadows of the canopy overhead. Inside, the air was cool and damp, smelling of earth and gun oil. His RPD light machine gun sat on its bipod, aimed down at the kill zone. Beside him, 600 rounds of 7.62 by 39 millimeters ammunition sat in neat belts. His comrades in the neighboring bunkers covered every approach. They had studied the American tactics, knew their patterns, understood their weapons. The M14 rifles had an effective range of 460 meters, but were too long for close jungle work. The new M16 S-jammed constantly in humidity and dust. The M60 machine guns were deadly, but took time to set up. Hand grenades could only be thrown perhaps 30 meters, and the Americans' own rifle grenades were clumsy devices that required special sight attachments and blank cartridges. Between 30 meters and the minimum range of the 60 millimeters mortar at 100 meters, there existed a void, a gap in American firepower where a well-positioned enemy could operate with near impunity. The NVA soldiers smiled in the darkness. The Americans would come down that trail, and when they did, his position would be invulnerable. They could throw grenades that would fall short. They could fire rifles that couldn't penetrate his overhead cover. They would die in the open while he remained safely entombed in earth. This was his certainty. This was his advantage. 300 meters away, Specialist Terry Pollard sat in the right seat of a Hughes OH-6A Loach helicopter, his legs dangling out over nothing, searching the green chaos below for exactly what the NVA soldier believed could not be found. The little helicopter, barely bigger than a compact car, skimmed the treetops at 60 knots with its doors removed, turning the crew compartment into a wind tunnel that made conversation impossible without the intercom. Chief Warrant Officer Ryan Arnson flew from the left seat, his hands and feet making constant micro-adjustments to keep the nimble machine stable and the thermal updrafts rising from the jungle floor. They had flown together for 4 months, an eternity in area reconnaissance where the average life expectancy of a Loach crew was measured in weeks, not months. They communicated now in glances and gestures, finishing each other's tactical thoughts, reading the terrain together like a language only they understood. Behind Pollard, secured to a bungee cord, hung a chopped M60 machine gun. On the left side of the aircraft, opposite the crew, an XM-27 minigun system sat like a coiled snake with 2,000 rounds of Link 7.62 by 51 millimeters ammunition. 1,500 feet above them, an AH-1G Cobra attack helicopter orbited in lazy circles, its pilot watching the Loach through his chin turret, finger resting near the trigger that controlled both a multi-barrel minigun and 19 2.75-inch rockets. This was a pink team, hunter and killer working in tandem. The Loach would find the enemy. The Cobra would destroy him. But hanging on the back of Arnson's armored seat, secured by a simple web sling, was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't work from a helicopter. Something that violated every doctrine written about aerial gunnery. Something that had, according to official U.S. Army field manuals, no business being anywhere near a vibrating, unstable rotary wing aircraft traveling at variable speeds over uneven terrain. The M79 grenade launcher weighed 6 pounds, 2 ounces empty. It was 28.7 inches long with a 14-inch barrel made of aluminum alloy, hard coat anodized to a dull gray that didn't reflect light. The receiver was steel. The stock and fore end were black walnut, though some later models used fiberglass reinforced plastic the color of dried blood. It was a break-action design, hinged like a single-barrel shotgun from the 1890s, absurdly simple in an era when the Pentagon was pouring millions into complex weapon systems. You pushed the barrel release lever to the right, and the barrel tipped down with a solid click. You inserted a single 40 by 46 millimeters round, a stubby cartridge that looked like an oversized shotgun shell pregnant with a grenade. You snapped the barrel closed. The act of opening the breech automatically cocked the internal hammer and engaged the safety. You thumbed the safety off. You pulled the trigger. The weapon produced a distinctive low-velocity report. Not the sharp crack of a rifle, but a hollow thump that gave the M79 its nickname among troops who actually use it. The Thumper, the Blooper, the Bloop Tube. Then you broke it open and did it all again. One shot. Reload. One shot. Reload. In a firefight where M16S could spit 700 rounds per minute, and the M60 could chew through belt of ammunition like a mechanical harvester. The M79 operator got one round every 5 seconds if he was fast. The official designation when it entered service in 1960 was Launcher, Grenade, 40mm M79. It had been designed at the U.S. Army's Springfield Armory in Massachusetts over a 7-year period beginning in 1953 under something called Project Niblick. The Army had wanted to bridge the gap, that deadly void between hand grenades maxing out at 30 meters and mortar fire starting at 100 meters. They had wanted to give the infantry squad its own artillery, immediate and organic, that didn't require calling for fire support and waiting while men died. The first prototypes were labeled with the letter S for Springfield. The S-3 became the S-5. The infantry board at Fort Benning demanded a semi-automatic, multiple-shot weapon. Springfield's engineers built the S-6T14081, a 3-shot launcher fed from a bizarre horizontal magazine that moved sideways after each shot, driven by something called negator spring. It was ingenious. It was sophisticated. It failed constantly. The chambers misaligned. Gas leaked. Accuracy disappeared. Longer specialty rounds like CS gas or illumination flares wouldn't fit. The Army canceled it. Engineer Dave Katz, working under Cy Moore at Springfield, went back to the simple break-action S5 design. No magazines. No semi-automatic mechanism. Just a single-shot weapon that opened and closed like a farmer's rabbit gun. In 1959, it became the XM79. On December 15, 1960, it was type classified as the M79. Cost to the government, $318 per unit. The bureaucratic arguments against using it from helicopters were sound and reasonable. The M79 was designed for shoulder-fired use from stable ground positions with the stock pressed firmly against the operator's shoulder and the rubber recoil pad absorbing rearward energy. The operator needed both hands, one to grip the stock, one to support the barrel and operate the barrel release. The sight system was a complicated adjustable ladder graduated from 75 meters to 375 meters in 25-meter increments, requiring the operator to judge range, set elevation, adjust for windage using a knob on the right side of the sight that moved impact 11 inches per click at 200 meters. When raised, the sight was fragile and easily damaged. When the helicopter banked, the operator would shift. When it turned, the reference points would spin. When it climbed or dove, the angle would change. The Grenade traveled at only 250 feet per second, slower than most .45 ACP pistol rounds. Wind would affect it. Rotor wash would deflect it. The helicopter's forward speed would add or subtract velocity, depending on direction of fire. Computing a firing solution required calculus. It was impractical. It was dangerous. It was inefficient. And yet Terry Pollard could put a 40mm high-explosive round through a bunker firing port from a moving helicopter at 50 meters with enough consistency that Arntzen would slow the Loach specifically to give him the shot, because Pollard had long since thrown away the complicated ladder sights instruction manual. He didn't use the graduations. He didn't adjust the windage knob. He didn't calculate trajectory. He had fired enough rounds that the knowledge lived in his hands and eyes and the unconscious part of his brain that judged distance in motion and relative speed. The same way an outfielder doesn't calculate the parabolic path of a fly ball, but simply runs to where it will land. The same way a quarterback doesn't compute wind resistance, but throws to where the receiver will be. Pollard just knew. Arntzen slowed the Loach now, applying left cyclic to put the little helicopter into a sideways crab that kept both crew members on the right side with clear lines of sight. They were searching for trails, disturbed earth, the geometric shapes that don't occur in nature. And Pollard saw it. That dark gash amidst a random jumble of brush, a vertical slash of shadow that was too perfect, too straight. He said 2 words into the intercom. Arnson slid the Loach sideways, pedal turning to change angle without changing position. The shadow resolved into void. A firing port, 2 feet wide, 6 inches high, cut into packed earth. Behind it, darkness. In that darkness, a machine gun. And behind that machine gun, men who believed they were invisible. The OH-6A hung in the air like a hummingbird, its rotor blades clawing at molecules. Arnson making microscopic adjustments with the cyclic to hold position in the churning air. Pollard releases M60, letting it swing on its bungee cord, and lifted the M79 from where it hung on Arnson's seatback. The weapon was already loaded. It always was. In a helicopter over enemy territory, you didn't fly with an empty gun. The round chamber was M406 high explosive. Weight, 8 ounces, including the projectile. The projectile itself contained 1.1 ounces of Composition B explosive, a military mixture of RDX and TNT. When that explosive detonated, the segmented steel body of the grenade would fragment along its pre-engraved lines, creating approximately 300 steel fragments, each weighing roughly 2 grains, traveling initially at 5,000 feet per second. The bursting radius was 5 meters. The casualty radius was officially listed as 5 meters, but in the confined space of a bunker was effectively infinite. One grenade in an enclosed space would kill or disable everyone inside, not from fragmentation alone, but from overpressure, the shock wave that would rupture lungs, burst eardrums, cause traumatic brain injury, and induce immediate unconsciousness even in those not directly struck by fragments. But the grenade had to travel at least 14 meters before it armed. That was a safety feature built into the fuse mechanism. Inside the nose of the grenade, a spring-loaded rotor held the firing pin away from the detonator. As the grenade spun, the rifling in the barrel imparted 37,000 rotations per minute. Centrifugal force overcame the spring tension, and the rotor aligned, arming the fuse. Below 14 meters, the grenade was inert. It might crack someone's skull with its mass. 8 ounces traveling at 250 feet per second carried some kinetic energy, but it wouldn't explode. Pollard was hovering at approximately 30 meters. He had room. Barely. He pulled the stubby weapon into his shoulder, or as close to his shoulder as he could manage while sitting sideways in a doorless helicopter with his legs out and his body twisted. He brought the barrel up. He had done this hundreds of times. From the ground. From helicopters. Moving and stationary. Against bunkers, spider holes, trillings, sampans on rivers. He didn't aim so much as point. His eyes locked on that dark rectangle. His brain calculated distance, drop, the relative motion of the helicopter, all of it happening faster than conscious thought. He thumbed the safety forward. His finger tightened on the trigger. The M79's report was swallowed by rotor noise. He felt the gentle thump of recoil, more of a push than a kick. The grenade arced across the gap, a dark blur like a hornet but slower, almost lazy. It flew straight through the firing port and disappeared into darkness. For a half second, nothing. Then a flash, bright orange, contained, almost immediately snuffed by smoke. The smoke came not from the firing port alone, but from a dozen hidden vents and cracks in the hillside, gray-white streamers erupting from ground that had looked solid, revealing the bunker's true size and the complexity of its construction. And then the world caught fire. Green tracers came up from 3 positions simultaneously, claw at the Loach like luminous fingers. The NVA soldier in the bunker had not been alone. His position had been part of a network. Interlocking fields of fire, mutually supporting, each bunker covering the dead space of the others. Arnson didn't think. There was no time for thinking. He rolled the Loach hard left, the little helicopter pivoting on its rotor mast, G-forces pressing both men into their seats as the aircraft went nearly 90 degrees of bank. Pollard felt rounds connecting with the airframe, solid metallic impacts that were felt more than heard. He released the M79, letting it fall behind him, and stood up in the doorframe, one hand gripping the roof frame, one hand on his M60, pulling it up against its bungee as Arnson leveled out. The machine gun's buttstock was gone, cut down to a pistol grip to save weight. Pollard fired from the hip, or as close to hip as you could manage when standing in a helicopter, his tracer stitching across the tree line, in red streaks that intersected with the green enemy tracers like some deadly crosshatch pattern. Arnson's thumb found the minigun trigger. The XM-27 on the left side of the aircraft spun up with a sound like ripping canvas. For 1,000 rounds per minute, the cyclic rate so high that individual shots blurred into a continuous roar. Brass casings vomited out of the ejection port, glittering in the sun as they tumbled toward the jungle below. The sustained fire from both guns, Pollard's M60 and Arnson's minigun, shredded vegetation, bark exploding, leaves disintegrating, the forest itself seeming to come apart under the onslaught. But they were already moving, Arnson pulling pitch and pushing the cyclic forward, the Loach accelerating like a startled animal, rotor RPM winding up as they clawed for altitude. Above them, the Cobra rolled hot. The pilot had seen the tracers, had the target area marked. He toggled his rocket pod select. 2.75-inch rockets rippled off the rails, their motors igniting in sequence, white smoke trails etching curves through the air. The rockets hit the hillside and detonated in overlapping fireballs, high-explosive warheads designed to kill armor now tearing open earth. The blast waves visible as expanding spheres of distorted air. The Cobra's own minigun opened up, raking the impact area, suppressing any survivors. The engagement lasted 11 seconds from Pollard's first shot to the Cobra's last rocket. They were already 3 clicks away when the Cobra pulled up. Back at Key Sand, a maintenance sergeant found 7 bullet holes in the Loach. One had passed through transmission cowling, missing the main rotor gearbox by 3 inches. Another had gone through the tail boom between 2 critical control cables. Arnson logged it in his aircraft maintenance record without comment. Pollard cleaned his M79, broke it down, wiped carbon from the aluminum barrel with solvent and a bore brush, reassembled it, loaded it, and hung it back on the pilot seat armor. The next morning they flew again. What Terry Pollard had done, what hundreds of M79 grenadiers in Vietnam were doing every day, violated no written regulation because no regulation existed governing how you were or were not supposed to use an M79. The weapon had entered service in 1961. The first U.S. ground combat units arrived in Vietnam in 1965. Between 1961 and 1965, M79 Grenadiers were assigned to units following the official table of organization and equipment. 1 Grenadier per fire team, or 2 per squad, equipped with an M79, a 40-round bandolier of mixed ammunition, and an M1911A 1.45 caliber pistol as backup. The pistol was meant to give the Grenadiers some means of self-defense at close range where the M79's minimum arming distance made the weapon useless. But a .45 pistol holds 7 rounds. It has an effective range of perhaps 25 meters. In a close-quarters jungle firefight where North Vietnamese regulars or Viet Cong guerrillas erupted from spider holes at distances measured in feet, an M79 operator with an empty launcher and a 7-shot pistol was effectively unarmed. Some Grenadiers carried captured AK-47s. Some carried M16s slung across their backs, making them the only soldiers humping 2 primary weapons. Some cut down their M79s, sawing off the stock and shortened the barrel, turned them into massive single-shot pistols that could be holstered, brutal close-range weapons that gave up accuracy for portability. Navy SEALs still carry these sawed-off versions today, calling them pirate guns. The problem the M79 solved was simple. The problem it created was equally simple. Every weapon system represents a trade-off. The M79 gave a squad immediate indirect fire capability, the ability to drop explosive rounds behind cover, into windows, over walls, into trenches. Its maximum effective range against area targets was 400 meters. Against point targets like a doorway or a bunker slit, 150 meters. The latter site, when used properly by someone who took the time to set it up, allowed for surgical precision. A trained grenadier could put a round through a window on the 3rd try, adjusting for windage and elevation. But this was a weapon with a rate of fire slower than a muzzle-loading musket from 1776. Revolutionary War soldiers could fire and reload a flintlock 3 times per minute if they were good. An M79 grenadier could fire and reload 6 times per minute if he was fast, and only if he didn't need to adjust his complicated ladder sight between shots. And each of those shots required carrying a 46mm round that weighed 8 ounces. A soldier's load in Vietnam averaged 70 to 80 pounds. That was rifle, ammunition, water, rations, entrenching tool, poncho, medical supplies, grenades. An M79 grenadier carrying a 40-round bandolier was adding an additional 20 pounds in 100-degree heat, through jungle so thick that movement was measured in meters per hour, not kilometers. But the capability was worth the trade-off because of what the M79 could do that nothing else could do. Hand grenades were limited by how far a man could throw. The average soldier could throw an M26 fragmentation grenade perhaps 35 meters. An athlete might reach 40. Beyond that, you needed something else. The rifle grenades that have been standard issue since World War II, the M9A1 anti-tank rifle grenade, the M17 fragmentation rifle grenade, gave greater range but required attaching a special launcher to the muzzle of an M14 rifle and loading a special blank cartridge to propel the grenade. It was slow, it was cumbersome, and it meant your rifle was temporarily out of action while configured as a grenade launcher. The 60mm mortar had a minimum range of 100 meters because of the high angle of fire required. Anything closer and around would either impact too soon or the trajectory would put it in danger of hitting friendly forces. Between 35 meters and 100 meters, there was nothing. That gap was where the enemy built bunkers, position machine guns, established fighting positions. They knew American squads couldn't effectively engage them there. The M79 filled that gap, and it did it with a variety of ammunition that made it one of the most versatile weapons ever issued to infantry. The standard M406 high-explosive round created that 5-meter casualty radius. The M381 round was similar. The M397 and M433 high-explosive dual-purpose rounds, introduced later, could penetrate 2 inches of steel armor at a 90-degree angle while still producing fragmentation. For marking targets or signaling, there were smoke rounds in multiple colors: white, red, green, yellow. For illumination at night, the M583 parachute flare round would burst at 400 feet and deploy a parachute-suspended flare burning at 50,000 candle power for 40 seconds. For riot control or flushing enemy soldiers from bunkers and tunnels, the M651CS gas round dispersed tear gas in a 10-meter radius. For close-range work with a high-explosive rounds wouldn't arm, there were 2 solutions. The first was the M576 buckshot round, called a meatball or the super buckshot, loaded with 20 or 27 hardened steel pellets, depending on version. At 20 meters, it would pattern like a shotgun. At 50 meters, it would spread to ineffectiveness. But inside that 20-meter envelope, it was devastating. The second was the M674 flechette round, the beehive, loaded with 45 thin steel darts. It made a buzzing sound in flight. It was also nearly worthless because the flechettes wouldn't orient point forward until they'd traveled 15 to 30 meters. Inside that distance, they'd hit sideways and bounce off. At extended range, they lacked penetration. The buckshot round replaced it. In practice, experienced grenadiers carried a mix, perhaps 20 rounds. 10 buckshot, 5 smoke, 5 illumination. They learned the ballistics by feel. They learned to skip grenades off the ground and into doorways. They learned to bounce them off tree trunks to get angles around cover. They learned that in thick jungle, you could air blast a round by hitting a branch above the target, showering the area with fragments. They became, in effect, organic artillery. The nickname given to M79 grenadiers by their squad leaders was the platoon leader's artillery, because while calling for 105mm howitzer fire support or an airstrike required radio communication, forward observer training, coordination with higher headquarters, and wait time measured in minutes, asking your grenadier to drop a round on that bunker 30 meters ahead required pointing and 2 seconds. 350,000 M79 grenade launchers were manufactured between 1961 and 1971. Springfield Armory made the first batch. Then contracts were awarded to private companies. Action Manufacturing Company in Bristol, Pennsylvania. Kennard Corporation in Kingston, Pennsylvania. Thompson Ramo Woolridge, TRW. Exotic Metal Products in Pasadena, California. though it's unclear if they actually delivered any. Each manufacturer's weapons had slight variations, different stampings, different finishes. Some stocks were walnut, some were that maroon fiberglass. All of them worked the same way. Break open, load, close, fire. They served in every major American unit in Vietnam. The 1st Cavalry Division, the 101st Airborne, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, the 9th Infantry Division, the Marines, Special Forces, Navy SEALs. Australian forces called it the Wombat Gun. The South Vietnamese used them. Even some Viet Cong units carried captured M79s. By 1968, the Army had realized the fundamental vulnerability of the M79 operator and had begun fielding a solution. The M203 grenade launcher, developed by AI Corporation, mounted underneath the barrel of an M16 rifle. It was a single-shot weapon like the M79, but used a sliding barrel instead of break action. You press the barrel release, slid the barrel forward, insert a round, pulled the barrel back until it locked. The sight was simpler, a flip-up leaf on the M16's handguard. The weapon added 3 pounds to the rifle's weight. But now the Grenadier had a rifle, 30 rounds of 5.56 millimeters, plus a grenade launcher. The M203 entered service in 1969 and gradually replaced the M79 in frontline units. But the M79 never entirely disappeared. Special operations units kept them. Helicopter crews kept them. Anyone who needed a dedicated grenade launcher, while the bulk of an M203 equipped rifle preferred the standalone M79. What made both weapons possible was a German invention from the end of World War II. The Nazis, desperate for weapons that could be mass-produced cheaply while still providing anti-tank capability, had developed something called the Hochniederdruck system, the high-low pressure system. Conventional firearms worked on a simple principle: ignite propellant in a confined space, use the expanding gases to accelerate a projectile down a barrel. But this required heavy barrels and receivers to contain the pressure, which in high-velocity anti-tank guns reached 50,000 pounds per square inch. Recoilless rifles like the bazooka eliminated the heavy barrel by venting the propellant gases rearward, canceling recoil, but they used enormous quantities of propellant and produced a massive backblast signature. The high-low pressure system was different. Inside the cartridge case, you had 2 chambers. A small high-pressure chamber contained the propellant charge. This chamber had several small holes drilled through its walls. When the propellant ignited, it built up pressure inside the high-pressure chamber, approximately 35,000 psi in the case of the 40 by 46 millimeters round. But the gases could only escape through those small holes into a larger low-pressure chamber surrounding it. The result was a controlled bleed down to approximately 3,000 psi, low enough to use an aluminum barrel instead of steel, low enough to keep recoil manageable, but still enough pressure to accelerate an 8-ounce projectile to 250 feet per second and send it 400 meters downrange. The Germans had designed a weapon called the Panzerwerfer for 600 using this system. Only 250 were produced. None saw combat. But the concept survived, was refined by American engineers, and became the operating principle behind every 40mm grenade launcher the U.S. has fielded since 1960. The engagement Terry Pollard and Ryan Arnson survived that day was not exceptional. It was routine. Pink teams flew multiple missions daily. Loaches were shot down at a rate that made them the most dangerous assignment in Army aviation. Of 1,419 OH, 6A Loach helicopters delivered to the Army, 842 were destroyed in Vietnam. That's a loss rate of nearly 60%. Crews who survived a 4-month tour were considered veterans. Those who made it to 6 months were legendary. Arnson and Pollard flew together for 9 months before Arnson rotated home. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Pollard received an Air Medal. Neither medal citation mentioned the M79. 3 weeks after that mission, a field-grade officer from Battalion Logistics arrived at Key Sand to inspect the Loach Squadron's armament inventory. He found M79 grenade launchers being carried on aircraft that were not authorized in the Table of Organization to possess them. He He found ammunition bandoliers secured with bungee cords and zip ties instead of proper mounting brackets. He found sawed-off M79s that had been illegally modified. He found stocks that had been shortened. He found sights that had been removed. He found weapons that bore serial numbers assigned to ground units, but had somehow migrated to aviation units. He wrote a report documenting these discrepancies and recommending corrective action. The squadron commander, a lieutenant colonel who had flown Hueys in the first wave at Ia Drang, read the report. He called the logistics officer into his office. The conversation lasted 2 minutes. The logistics officer was told that in the past 30 days, Loach crews using a combination of M60 machine guns, miniguns, M79 grenade launchers, and coordinated fires from Cobra gunships had located and neutralized 17 bunker complexes, destroyed 11 anti-aircraft positions, killed an estimated 150 enemy soldiers, and enabled 3 successful ground operations that would have otherwise failed due to enemy fortifications. He was told that of the 12 Loach aircraft in the squadron, 8 had been shot down at least once and repaired. He was told that 4 pilots and 3 crew members were dead. He was told that the survivors owed their lives to having the right weapon for the job when they needed it, and that if the table of organization didn't authorize M79s for helicopter crews, then the table of organization was wrong. He was told that no corrective action would be taken. He was told this politely, but with a tone that made it clear the conversation was over. The logistics officer returned to battalion headquarters. His report was filed. Nothing changed. This pattern repeated across Vietnam. Official doctrine said one thing. Reality said another. And when official doctrine met reality in combat, reality won. Because doctrine is written by men in offices considering hypothetical scenarios, but tactics are written by men in jungles trying not to die. The M79 was designed to be fired from a stable standing position at a range of 100 to 300 meters using a ladder sight and deliberate aim fire. Instead, it was fired from moving helicopters, from riverboats, from back of trucks, from behind rice paddies, from sitting positions, from prone positions, from rooftops. It was fired at ranges from 15 meters to 400 meters. It was fired using the ladder sight, the fixed battle sight, Kentucky windage, instinct, hope, and prayer. It was used to breach doors by firing at hinges. It was used to detonate suspicious objects that might be booby traps. It was used to mark targets for airstrikes. It was used to start fires. It was used to clear spider holes. It was used in ways the engineers at Springfield Armory in 1960 never imagined and never intended. And it worked. That was the thing. For all its limitations, the single-shot capacity, the slow reload, the vulnerability it created for the operator, it worked. In the specific tactical environment of Vietnam, where engagement happened at close range in thick terrain against fortified positions, the M79's ability to deliver explosive force precisely where it was needed made it invaluable. A study conducted by the Army after the war analyzed small unit engagements and found that squads equipped with M79 grenade launchers had significantly higher success rates in assaulting fortified positions than squads without them. The difference was quantifiable, measurable, undeniable. This data, combined with feedback from field commanders, changed American infantry doctrine. The gap between hand grenades and mortars was now recognized as critical. Every infantry squad needed organic indirect fire capability. The M203 became standard issue. Then the M320, a side-loading design that could fire longer rounds. Then the M32 rotary grenade launcher, a 6-shot revolver-style weapon. Then various underbarrel and standalone 40mm systems developed by manufacturers around the world. The principle established by the M79, that infantry needed immediate organic, accurate indirect fire, became foundational. Today, virtually every modern military fields some form of 40mm grenade launcher. The Russians have the GP-25 and GP-30. The Germans have the AG-36. The Chinese have the QLG-10. All of them descendants of that original 1960s-era design, that break-action launcher developed at Springfield Armory to fill a gap. Terry Pollard came home in March of 1968. He was 22 years old. He had flown 387 combat missions. He had been shot down twice. He had fired an M79 grenade launcher from a helicopter more times than he could count. The number lost somewhere in the continuous blur of missions where one day bled into another until individual engagements became indistinguishable. He went home to Pennsylvania. He worked construction for 3 years, then got a job with a utility company. He married. He had 2 daughters. He coached their softball teams. He taught them to drive. He attended their graduations. He didn't talk about Vietnam. When his daughters asked years later what he did in the war, he said he was a door gunner. He didn't mention the M79. He didn't mention the bunker. He didn't mention the tracers with the sound of rounds hitting the airframe or the 3 seconds when the Loach was banking so hard he thought they were going to roll inverted and cartwheel into the jungle. He didn't mention that the helicopter they'd been flying that day was shot down 2 weeks later with a different crew, killing both men aboard. In 1987, during a Memorial Day weekend, he was at a hardware store buying lumber. He was 41 years old, graying at the temples, wearing jeans and a polo shirt, indistinguishable from 1,000 other middle-aged men buying supplies for home projects. He was in the aisle looking at wood screws when he heard it. That sound, the distinctive hollow thump of an M79 firing, unmistakable, impossible. It came from somewhere outside. He dropped the box of screws and walked quickly toward the sound, heart hammering, hands suddenly slick with sweat. Outside in the parking lot, there was a Veterans of Foreign Wars post doing a demonstration for a group of kids. They had set up a table with deactivated weapons, M16S with welded bolts, an M60 with a cut receiver, and an M79 grenade launcher. A Vietnam vet, older than Pollard, wearing a faded boonie hat, was showing the kids how it worked. He was dry firing it. That was the sound. The hammer falling on an empty chamber. Not the actual report of a live round, but close enough that Pollard's entire nervous system had responded before his conscious mind could engage. He stood there for a moment, watching. The vet was demonstrating how to open the action, how to close it. He was telling the kids about the weapon. His voice was steady. Matter of fact, he wasn't telling war stories. He was just explaining the mechanics. Pollard turned and walked back into the store. He paid for his lumber. He drove home. He built a deck that weekend. He didn't mention the incident to his wife. But that night, lying in bed, he thought about Ryan Arnson, the pilot who had kept that helicopter steady while Pollard fired. He thought about the Cobra pilot circling overhead. He thought about the maintenance crew at Keys and who patched bullet holes in airframes and never complained about the extra work. He thought about all the guys who didn't come home. The M79 grenade launcher remained in U.S. military inventory long after Vietnam. National Guard units used them into the 1980s. Special Operations Forces still use them today, particularly the sawed-off pirate gun version for breaching operations. In Iraq and Afghanistan, M79s were issued again for neutralizing improvised explosive devices, allowing soldiers to detonate IEDs from a safe distance without exposure to secondary explosions or ambush. The weapon that was supposed to be obsolete, replaced by the M203 and then the M320, kept coming back because it did one thing better than any alternative. It was simple. No gas system to clean. No magazine to load. No battery for electronics. Just break it open. Insert a round. Close it. Fire. If it got muddy, you wiped it off. If it got wet, you let it dry. It worked. In a world where military technology has become increasingly complex, where infantry now carry night vision, thermal optics, laser designators, GPS, encrypted radios, there remains something to be said for a weapon that requires nothing but the knowledge of how to open a hinge and pull a trigger. The fortified bunker that Terry Pollard hit that day in 1967 was one of perhaps 15,000 such bunkers destroyed by M79 fire during the course of the war. The exact number is unknown because individual grenade strikes weren't tracked the way artillery missions or airstrikes were. But Army after-action reports are filled with references. Bunker neutralized by M79 fire. Enemy position destroyed by grenade launcher. Target suppressed by 40mm rounds. Each entry represents a moment when an infantry squad came under fire from a concealed position, when the squad leader pointed and said, "Bunker, 1 o'clock, 50 meters," when the grenadier raised his weapon and dropped a round through a firing port or over a berm or into a window. Each entry represents men who went home because someone else had learned to use a stubby single-shot launcher with precision of an artillery piece. The M79 didn't win the Vietnam War. No single weapon wins wars. But it kept men alive. It gave infantry squads the ability to fight from a distance in a conflict where distance meant survival. And in the end, that was what mattered. Not the specifications. Not the bureaucratic paperwork. Not the debates about doctrine. What mattered was whether the weapon worked when a 20-year-old specialist from Pennsylvania needed to put a grenade through a hole in a hillside while sitting sideways in a doorless helicopter traveling 60 knots. Because on that day, for those men, the distance between being shot down and making it home was measured in the precise arc of a 40-millimeter grenade and the steady hands of someone who had learned to make an improbable weapon do an impossible job. Terry Pollard died in 2003 from heart failure at age 57. The M79 he carried in Vietnam is in a military museum in Pennsylvania, donated by his family. It sits in a glass case with a small placard giving the specifications and dates of service. It doesn't mention Terry Pollard. It doesn't mention Ryan Arnson. It doesn't mention the bunker or the mission or the 7 bullet holes in the helicopter. It just lists the statistics. But sometimes veterans visiting the museum will stop and look at it for a long time. And sometimes they'll smile just a little and shake their heads because they know. They know what it meant to hear that sound, that distinctive thump, and know that help was incoming. They know what it meant to have that weapon. And they know, in the way that only people who were there can know, that because someone was carrying it, and because someone knew how to use it, certain people came home